My name is Kourosh Parham. I'm the president of the American Society of Geriatric Otolaryngology. With me tonight are the members of the Executive Council who've been kind enough to join us and help us organize this session. Tonight, our guest of honor is Dr. Justin Golub. Dr. Golub is Associate Professor of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery at Columbia University Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. And he completed his medical school at Emory and then went on to University of Washington in Seattle, where he completed his residency. He then received a very prestigious fellowship in neurotology at University of Cincinnati. As if he wasn't clinically and research-wise busy enough, he took on a master's degree in public health on biostatistics and patient-oriented research. I'm sure that positioned him to successfully compete for NIH funding because he's amongst the few in our field that has accomplished that distinction, and I congratulate him on that. In his young career, he's been the author of more than 60 peer-reviewed publications. He has co-authored 3 books. He's cited widely and quoted by authoritative journals like the New York Times. He is truly a leading pioneer in neurotology and otology. He is leading his field in invasive endoscopic, in minimally invasive endoscopic ear surgery. And he's had a long time interest in optimizing treatment of age-related hearing loss and improving outcomes of endoscopic sinus surgery. Now, if I may add to that introduction, I met Dr. Golub, I think it was, and I'm giving away probably my age, and certainly not Justin's because there's a big separation between our age. Back in 2008, I'm saying, that was my first American Society of Geriatric Otolaryngology meeting that I was attending. And I have brought a resident with me. And Dr. Johns and his partner at the time, Adam Klein, had brought a medical student with him. And that medical student was Justin Golub, and he gave a superb presentation. And believe me, he has made such an impression on me that I never forgot about him since that meeting there. And I am so proud that he is now the lead-off speaker of the ASGO seminar series, and it kind of brings it full circle. And I'm also proud to announce that Dr. Golub has agreed to join the Executive Council of the American Society of Geriatric Otolaryngology. So we're greatly going to benefit from his insight, experience, and energy. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn the platform over to Dr. Golub. Just want to note that the session is being recorded. Dr. Golub has been very kind to allow us to record this session so we can make it widely available to others who are interested and couldn't join us. It will be posted on the ASGO webpage. And I don't have to go over the Zoom etiquette with you, but please keep your mics muted. And at the end, there will be an opportunity to interact with Dr. Golub. Thank you so much, Dr. Golub. The platform is yours.
Well, thanks, Dr. Parham. Thanks for that really nice introduction. I'm honored to be here. I'm an associate professor at Columbia. And many moons ago, I was a medical student under Mike Johns, who introduced me to the world of otolaryngology. So I really appreciate his mentorship. I definitely wouldn't be sitting here without him. Thank you. He's driving. Please look at the road. Thanks. All right, so this talk is about the brain effects of age-related hearing loss. You could go ahead and advance. And so we're meant to down. The next slide is just a bunch of disclosures. You could skip this. Next slide. So what am I? So go ahead, next slide. So I'm an otologist, neurotologist. So this is me doing endoscopic ear surgery, which is my main clinical niche. That's not the subject of this talk. Next slide. In the other part of my life, I'm an age-related hearing loss researcher. And so on the left is my mentees, and on the right are my mentors. So in the academic pyramid, I sit squarely in the middle, where I have finally some people under me who can help me and who I can teach, but then also a lot of people over me who are very instrumental in getting me to the next step. Next slide. And just to show how much fun we have, this is us going to a restaurant, a bar in New York as soon as that was possible, and once we had the vaccine. Next slide. So our medical center here at Columbia, where I'm sitting right now, is in the very northern tip of Manhattan. So this is a view of Manhattan Island. If your back is to Midtown and you're looking northward, this is the view, the green square is Central Park, and Columbia is all the way at the top, practically in Vermont or Maine. Next slide. And so this is, one slide back. This is our medical center here, where I'm right in the middle. So I'm sitting right at the tip of the red arrow, right in the middle of this concrete structure. Next slide. So here's an overview of the talk. It's about 45 minutes. We started a couple of minutes late. Actually, it's probably more like 40 minutes. So if it ends at like 6:30, 6:25, is that good? What time do you want me to finish? If you don't say, I'll just stop at 5 minutes.
That's perfectly fine. 6:20 to 6:25 is a great target, and then
Okay.
there'll be some opportunity for question and answer.
Gotcha. I see my colleague Elliot Regenbogen. How are you? He's probably sitting right across the hall from me right now, or maybe hopefully at home in his office. Next slide. So this is the outline of the talk. We'll start out. Actually, go back one. We'll start out with some background, and then I'll talk about evidence for the association between hearing loss and cognitive problems. We'll talk about mechanisms. Then I'll discuss this entity of subclinical hearing loss, which I'm interested in, and then finally some conclusions. Next slide. So age-related hearing loss, I think it's interesting because it's applicable to everyone. Everyone here is going to get age-related hearing loss. It's guaranteed. If you are lucky enough to live long enough, you will get it. So on the y-axis here is amount of hearing loss, going from 0, which is normal, to 70, which is bad. And on the x-axis is your age, from 20 to 95. So you can see around age 60 to 70, almost everyone will have some hearing loss. Next slide. Age-related hearing loss accelerates over time. The only reason I put this slide is so I could incorporate a Tesla Roadster into my talk. No, I'm just kidding. So this is a study I did with this excellent med student, Rahul Sharma, who's going to be an intern in otolaryngology at Vanderbilt next year. And we modeled the acceleration of age-related hearing loss, and it actually follows a really super simple formula. Basically, it's constant acceleration. So the pure tone average in the better ear, which is a good single measure to capture how much hearing loss you have, it's basically the square of your age times a constant, 0.0052. Maybe I'll call it the Sharma-Golub constant. Next slide. So age-related hearing loss, incredibly common. Over 80% of people over 80 get it, and treatment's incredibly low. Under a quarter of people over 80 treat it. And that disparity I always found really troublesome. There's few conditions in medicine where almost everyone gets it and almost nobody treats it. And so I would call that an opportunity for investigation. Next slide. So I like to kind of put this in context. Pretend for a moment you were a medicine doctor, God forbid, but pretend you are an internal medicine physician and you're sitting at your desk and a nurse comes in and throws a lab slip on your desk, and it's this glucose of 280. And you're sitting across from a patient who has no symptoms. You may tell the patient then, oh, you may have diabetes, we're gonna have to treat this. The patient may respond, well, I have no symptoms, why should I? And then the medicine doctor, of course, is going to push back. They're gonna say, well, you have to treat it. You absolutely need to, even if you have no symptoms. Next slide. Because if you don't treat it, you're gonna have all these horrible things happen to you. You're gonna have eye problems and kidney disease and strokes and heart attacks and cognitive impairment. Next slide. Now let's flip over and pretend now you're an otolaryngologist sitting at that same desk, and a nurse comes in, throws a lab slip, a piece of paper on your desk, and it shows this audiogram. It might be the same analogous situation initially, where the patient says, well, I don't have any symptoms, I don't want to do anything. And then you would probably say, well, I recommend you treat it with a hearing aid. And then what typically happens then is the patient says, no, thank you. They leave and that's it, and you never see them again. Most times that's what happens. things. Most patients I see with age-related hearing loss, like 3 out of 4 times, don't do anything about it. So in contrast to what the medicine doctor does, you're not really going to be pushing back and saying, no, you have to wear hearing aids. You absolutely need to. Next slide. And the difference between the strength of recommendation between the medicine doctor and the otolaryngologist is that we don't really know what age-related hearing loss does. We know it's annoying. We know it affects communication, but we don't really know how broadly it affects your health and other conditions of aging. Next slide. And so that's one of the things that I've become interested in is what does age-related hearing loss actually cause? So when we talk about causation, we talk about exposures and outcomes or diseases. So this is kind of going to be appearing over and over in this talk. Exposure is going to be in red and disease is going to be blue. The exposure causes the disease. Example of that, strep bacteria causes strep throat. The exposure is the bacteria, the disease is strep throat. Next slide. So for most of hearing loss research, typically hearing loss is treated as the disease. Like if you open any otology journal about hearing loss, a clinical paper, it'll talk about pretty much risk factors for hearing loss, like, you know, noise exposure or drugs or genetic risk factors for hearing loss. And this has been the main focus of otolaryngology research, because if we can do something about these exposures in red, we could prevent the disease on the right, which to an otolaryngologist is the worst thing ever. You know, hearing loss. Sorry, definitely not the worst thing for head and neck surgeon. For an otologist, it's the worst thing ever. Tied maybe with facial weakness. Next slide. But if we flip the relationship around, we could say, okay, for people who have hearing loss, what does that cause? Does hearing loss cause other problems like cognitive impairment, dementia, and depression? So whereas otolaryngologists typically have just focused on hearing loss in the red, and audiologists, the rest of the world, the rest of medicine, they don't care about hearing loss, and they never will care about hearing loss. They care about the big ticket items, depression, dementia, cognitive impairment. And so this is why I think this is of such broad importance, because if hearing loss is causing other conditions, the world will take notice and changes will be made. And then we'll actually treat people with hearing loss like we should. Next slide. So now I'm just going to go through some overview slides of like basic epidemiologic associations. So we have these two things, hearing loss and cognitive decline. If they tend to go together, we call that an association. So I really hope everyone here knows that association is not the same as causation. Association just means two things happen to go together. Next slide. So how can they be related? So one possibility is that there's a causal relationship going from left to right. Hearing loss could cause cognitive decline. Next slide. But it's also possible that you could have an association where the opposite's happening. We would call that reverse causation. Cognitive decline is causing hearing loss. That's kind of weird in my opinion, but a lot of neurologists that I talk to think that that's more likely. Next. And if you don't know what's causing what, we would just simply say that it's associated. Next slide. And then there's this thing called a confounder. A confounder is this third variable. It's called a third variable because it's the third thing here, hearing loss and cognitive decline, where 1 and 2, confounder is number 3. A third variable that's causing both hearing loss and cognitive decline. For example, the ultimate confounder is age. If you're old, you're going to get hearing loss. If you're old, you may get cognitive decline. Purely because of that, we're going to find an association between hearing loss and cognition. So we have to do these statistical techniques called multivariable regression or adjusting, where we take into account these confounders, because obviously they're going to be confounders. Next slide. If there is a causal relationship, it's obviously going to be working through some mechanism. Hearing loss doesn't directly cause cognitive decline. The dead hair cells don't jump into the brain and scramble the neurons. It has to be working through something, or we would call that a mediator. It's the mechanism. Next slide. So my interest is finding out whether hearing loss causes dementia. So how could we do this? So one possibility is that, sorry, I usually have the bullets phase one by one. So just to reiterate, association does not equal causation. It's very hard actually to prove causation. So how would we prove causation? How would we prove that hearing loss causes dementia? So proof would be a randomized controlled trial where we would take a group of people, say half the people in the Zoom, and what we would do is we would randomize you to the hearing loss group. So I would find you and deafen you. I'd make you totally deaf. The other half of the Zoom I would leave alone. And then we'd come back 10 years later, and then I would see the group that I deafened if they tended to get dementia. Now, obviously, you would never do this in humans. It's unethical. You could do it in mice, though. So we would have to do the next best thing, which is take half of people and treat hearing loss, take half of people and not treat hearing loss, and see if the treatment group avoids getting dementia. And this is actually being done. There's some randomized trials in progress looking at this, so I'll talk about it at the end. But it's expensive, it's rare, and we don't have that data now for the most part. So what do we have now? We have the suggestive evidence, which is what I'm going to mainly talk about today, which means we just look in the wild at people who naturally tend to get hearing loss and see if they naturally tend to get dementia. And then we have to adjust for confounders like age. Next slide. And so this is sort of the strength of evidence of the types of clinical studies. The sort of the most basic study is a cross-sectional study, which is a single slice in time. Then the next better study is a longitudinal study, which happens over time. If you have a longitudinal study, you can at least establish what we call a temporal relationship. We can make sure the exposure or hearing loss happens before the outcome or dementia. If you know that something happened a decade before something else, you can much lower the chance of reverse causation where the outcome is causing the exposure. And then finally, at the bottom bullet, the best thing, of course, is randomized trials. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about the evidence. Next slide. So this is hopefully a review. The slide is more for the non-ENT crowd, but how do we measure hearing loss with a decibel? It goes from 0 to about 100. 0 is great, 100 is bad. We chop it up into these categories: normal, mild, moderate, and severe to profound. And then for most of these studies, we like to have a kind of a single variable to capture hearing loss, which makes doing the analysis and the statistics easier. And so we typically look at the pure tone average. That's our exposure. It's a single number that represents the mean hearing in decibels of a few pitches. So about 500, which is typically 500, 1,000, 2,000, and 4,000 hertz. You take the threshold of those 4 pitches, mean it, and you get a single decibel value from 0 to 100 that represents the hearing. Next slide. So this is our field seminal study. This is by Frank Lin at Johns Hopkins, who's one of my mentors in my K23 grant. And so about 10 years ago, he published this study looking at the relationship between hearing loss and dementia. The exposure was hearing loss measured by pure tone audiometry, and the outcome was incident dementia, or new cases of dementia. And the cohort was the Baltimore longitudinal study of aging. There are about 640 people in it. It occurred over 12 years, and they adjusted critically. They adjusted for these potential confounders. This is super important because these are the things that could cause hearing loss and also cause dementia, and they could cause basically a false association. So age, demographics, things like socioeconomic status, and cardiovascular disease. We always adjust for cardiovascular disease because it's common, and that's one of the theories of why age-related hearing loss arises. Basically, little microstrokes to the cochlea can cause hearing loss over life. And likewise, microvascular disease can cause dementia. You can have multi-infarct dementia, or vascular disease could potentially worsen Alzheimer's. So all that stuff was adjusted for. And here's the key take-home thing, the bottom bullet, which I'm going to say first, and which may be Greek to some people, and then I will explain in English what the heck it means. So they found a hazard ratio of 1.27 per 10 dB worsening in hearing loss, which was significant. So what that means is that for every 10 decibel worse the hearing got, the hazard, or basically risk, of getting demented over the study period went up 1.27 times, or 27%. So I'll say that one more time. For every 10 dB worse the hearing got, the risk of getting demented over that decade went up 27%. And that actually is pretty clinically meaningful, because a 10 decibel increase in hearing is not much. That's only about a half category worsening, going from like normal to halfway through the mild category. Next slide. So if you look over the range of hearing loss, you get this nice kind of like dose response curve. So here on the y-axis is the risk, basically the risk of getting demented, from 0 times to 10 times. This is like times, 10 times, 8 times, 6 times. And on the x-axis is the amount of hearing loss. And you can clearly see that as the amount of hearing loss goes up, the hazard or risk of getting demented over the study period goes up a lot. In fact, people who had severe hearing loss were like 7 times more likely to get dementia over the study period. Next slide. So this was pretty surprising. And this basically created like a whole new field looking at the effects of hearing loss, I feel. Next slide. And this has like been in the media. There's articles about this all the time in the New York Times and a bunch of different media outlets. I'd like everyone to be aware that I put Fox News to make this talk bipartisan. It was even featured in my Twitter in the bottom right several times. Next slide. So there have been quite a few studies looking at this. So now I will just present a meta-analysis of studies like the one I just showed. This is a couple years old, and this guy, Lowry from the UK, looked at originally 1,800 papers, narrowed it down to 36. He only looked at high quality studies that included audiometry. And there were like 100 e-figures and e-tables. And one day I got up and I drank a bunch of espressos and I looked at all of them. Next slide. And so just a couple summary slides from this meta-analysis. So what this is doing here is it's showing different studies in rows, and then it's giving you an odds ratio, which basically summarizes the finding from the study. So these three studies here look at cognitive impairment happening over time for people who have hearing impairment compared to people who don't have hearing impairment. And so an odds ratio of 1 means no increased odds or no increased risk, kind of. And so the squares basically mean what the odds ratio was, and the horizontal line, when you see one, is the confidence interval. So the point here is that if the horizontal line doesn't touch the orange vertical bar, it was significant. And so for 2 out of 3 of these, you could see it was significant, and the diamond at the very bottom shows the mean odds ratio. That diamond doesn't touch the orange vertical line. So what I'm trying to tell you here is that 2 out of 3 studies significantly found an association between hearing loss and developing cognitive impairment over time. Next slide. This is the same kind of thing, but now looking at dementia over time. And here, actually, all 3 out of these 3 studies were significant. So I'm trying to show you, I'm not cherry picking papers. If you look at meta-analyses, the balance of the literature supports this stuff. Next slide. And so the world has kind of taken notice. And this is an article from the Lancet Commission. This is done by the Lancet about risk factors for dementia. So pretty high impact review paper. And they found that if you were to completely eliminate hearing loss as a risk factor, assuming it's causally related to dementia, which is a big if because we don't know that, but assuming it's causally related, you'd reduce the prevalence of dementia by 8%, which is enormous. It's astoundingly big because dementia is like one of the 2 or 3 biggest public health problems facing this century. Dwarfs anything that we deal with in otolaryngology. For people who have older relatives with dementia, you realize how absolutely money-sucking and debilitating and horrible it is. If you could eliminate nearly 10% of those, that would save like billions and billions of dollars. And so just a brief anecdote about this paper. So this study actually cited one of my papers in which I worked with a bunch of neurologists. So when I came to Columbia 6 years ago, I became interested in this, and I went up to the 18th floor where the neurology research headquarters is, and met with a bunch of neurologists, and I knew this was going to happen. I predicted it, and I said, this is going to happen. I'm just going to go through it. And I met with them, and I said, hey, I think hearing loss is a risk factor for dementia. Will you study this with me? Because what do I know about dementia? I need a neurologist. And all of them laughed at me like I was out of my mind. Like, what? That's crazy. I've never heard of that. We all know that X, Y, and Z that we study is a risk factor. I've never read a single paper saying hearing loss has anything to do with dementia. And over time, I kept working at it. And now they have a paper with me that was cited in the Lancet. And I guess I didn't tell you the most important thing. So what this Lancet article did is they listed all of the risk factors for dementia, like smoking and education and activity. And hearing loss was the #1 more than any of the other risk factors that those neurologists studied. So I thought that was hilarious. Next slide. Hopefully there's no neurologists in the audience that are going to get me in trouble for telling this story. So now I'm just going to shift gears to randomized controlled trials, which are the highest level of evidence, but we really don't have much currently. So this is a randomized controlled trial from about 30 years ago in veterans. The intervention here is giving a hearing aid, a unilateral hearing aid versus not, aka a wait list. And the outcome is quality of life using this thing called the HHIE, or Hearing Handicap Inventory for the Elderly. They did not really look at dementia, but I'm just showing you what is available. So it's a quality of life study. There are a bunch of old vets. They were old. There were about 200, and they looked over 4 months. Next slide. And the results found that the hearing loss group had significant improvement in disease-specific quality of life using the HHIE and this other thing, the QDS. So that's exciting. We've proven with one RCT that a unilateral hearing aid in old veterans improves quality of life. But there are some limitations here. First, they used a unilateral hearing aid, which isn't the standard of care. These hearing aids are 30 years old, and they've radically changed since then. They didn't look at cognition. There was one sort of gross proxy for cognition. which is what I'm interested in. And of course, being vets, they're all old white men, and so it's not generalizable to people who aren't old white men vets. Next study. Next slide, rather. So there have been some newer RCTs that have tried to look at hearing loss as a treatment for cognition. So this is done by Wynn et al. This thing's a few years old. And here they randomize people to get a hearing aid versus a placebo hearing aid. I could spend a whole hour explaining why a placebo hearing aid doesn't make sense as a good placebo, because you just can't make a placebo hearing aid, but they tried. And the outcome was a cognitive battery. Now, these were people who already had Alzheimer's. So this is like a tertiary prevention study. People already have the disease and you're just trying to mitigate the disease. They're clearly not trying to prevent dementia. And these were old people. They started with 51, ended up with 38, and they looked over 6 months, and then they did a 6-month crossover. Next slide. And so this was basically a null result. They didn't find any differences between the groups. So it's a negative RCT. I'm showing this because there's barely any RCTs, and I'm trying to be fair and balanced. So I'm showing you this negative result. But there's a bunch of limitations here. The design was not that great. The N was small. A lot of people dropped out. And I think perhaps the biggest limitation is if you're giving a treatment, if you're doing an RCT comparing a treatment to a placebo, it's super important to know people got the treatment. And how do you know if they got hearing aids? You have to measure compliance with hearing aids, because if the hearing aids are not being worn, they're in the placebo group, not the hearing aid group. How do they assess compliance in people who have Alzheimer's? They ask them, did you wear hearing aids? Or they ask relatives. How reliable do you think it is to ask someone with dementia if they wore their hearing aids? They probably don't remember what they ate for breakfast. They wouldn't remember if they ate their hearing aids. So that kind of invalidates the methods for me. Next slide. And then there's actually a Cochrane review looking at treating mild to moderate age-related hearing loss with hearing aids. They looked at 5 RCTs. And basically this found that hearing aids improve hearing specific quality of life, general quality of life, and listening abilities, which is good. So we can say today in 2021 that we have, quote, proven that hearing aids improve quality of life and listening. Now, the problem with that is it's like really self-evident. I mean, you have to do the studies. If you think something's, the case, you have to do a study to prove it. But it's somewhat intuitive that if you put a listening device on someone, it's going to improve listening abilities. If someone can communicate better, they're going to have improved quality of life. It doesn't show anything beyond that. And I think that's what we need to do today. If we want to really make strides in hearing healthcare and get hearing aids covered by Medicare and have everyone wear a hearing aid who has hearing loss, or have everyone have ear surgery who has hearing loss, we have to show that treating hearing loss does something more than just quality of life. Quality of life is important, but like dementia, bigger ticket item. Next slide. So in the next section, I'm going to talk about the mechanisms through which hearing loss could be connected to cognitive impairment. Next slide. So this is crazy busy. I normally phase in each color one by one, not to give people vertigo, but I'll just give everyone vertigo. So just look at the green and don't look at anything else. So the green are these causal pathways. So how could age-related hearing loss in red be related to cognitive impairment in blue? One possibility is causal pathways. Another possibility is purple, non-causal pathways. Those are confounders. And then finally, there's reverse causation, which is the orange going from right to left. So actually, let's start with the purple. So let's talk about the non-causal pathways first. These are the confounders. So one possibility is that age-related hearing loss and dementia, not causally related. These things in purple cause both. So aging's a possibility because aging causes hearing loss, aging causes dementia. Little strokes can cause hearing loss, little strokes can cause dementia. And then the bottom box, it's possible that unknown things, some unknown neurodegenerative process causes hearing loss and cognitive impairment. That's possible. And since we don't know about this yet, we can't adjust for it in clinical studies. So that's a real possibility. The orange is reverse causation. So dementia, maybe the Alzheimer's pathology gets in the inner ear and causes hearing loss. That's what all the neurologists were telling me when I met them. But I don't think that's true for a number of reasons. One of which is they've never found the actual histopathologic changes of dementia in the inner ear. So the green are the causal pathways. So I'll go through this in a little more detail. So there's 3 mechanisms I put here. So one is a change in brain structure. Maybe hearing loss causes dementia through a change in brain structure. How would this work? Hearing loss obviously causes a change in input to the brain. That's what the ear is connected to. So if you don't hear good, the cochlear nerve, which ultimately connects to the temporal lobe, is going to send less of a signal to the temporal lobe, and the temporal lobe could atrophy. And since the temporal lobe is connected to other stuff in the brain, this could have cascading consequences. Next is reduced socialization. So people who don't hear well, they don't socialize as much. If you don't socialize as much, then you don't go to ASGO meetings, you don't get to hear me talk. Hearing me talk is probably cognitively stimulating. I would argue it's better for your brain health than scrolling TikTok videos or staring out the window looking at clouds. And you could see that over a period of 30 years, someone who can hear and is going to talks versus someone who can't and is sitting alone in their room staring at clouds over 30 years, the person who was engaged in the world and went to talks and socialized, they're going to have higher cognitive function. And then the third box is cognitive load. So this I think is true because people with hearing loss have told me it's true. People with hearing loss will say that if they really focus on the words, they can hear just fine. So if I'm talking and I say that I found a bat, B-A-T, in my house, they won't know if I said bat or rat or cat. So they have to think about the context. They'll say, well, Golub said he was cleaning his attic, so wouldn't have a cat in the attic. You could have a bat in the attic, but a bat wouldn't be like flying or something. It's probably not bad. It's probably bad. And they got the word correct, but by the time they realize that, I'm 3 sentences beyond, and they've lost the meaning of what I'm saying. Next slide. So next slide. And next slide. So I'm going to focus on change in brain structure, which is what I'm going to show you a few papers on. So how can we measure a change in brain structure? We could do this by looking at fancy neuroimaging, including MRIs, and these fancy PET scans that could pick up Alzheimer's pathology, like amyloid and tau. Amyloid and tau are two proteins that accumulate in the brain with Alzheimer's and other causes of dementia. Next slide. So I'm going to focus on beta amyloid because I have one study on this that is published. Next. So I'm going to show you the study that I did. Next slide. So yes, keep this slide. So when I came to Columbia, I wanted to study the relationship between hearing loss and dementia. And so I was counseled that I have to find someone that has lots of patients who are getting dementia evaluations. And what I need to do is I need to add a hearing test onto it. And so I found a collaborator, Jose Luxinger, he's a vice chair of research in medicine here. He has, on this slide, only 4 R01 like grants. He actually has now 5 R01 like grants. He runs this thing called the Northern Manhattan Study of Metabolism and Mind, and it's perfect. It's exactly what I need. It has brain imaging, it measures dementia, it measures cognition. It just doesn't have a hearing test. And that is something that can be solved with money. And so that's what I did. I worked my tail off and I got grants so that I could add a hearing test, and then NOMEM became NOMEM-H. So now we have a hearing test added onto it. Next slide. And that was my entire K23 strategy. And so this NOMEM hearing cohort is people around Columbia in the community. They're healthy people. They're not patients. They're normal people who are volunteering to do this study. They're late middle age, mostly Hispanic and Black, and then they had hearing tests. Next slide. And these are the questions that we asked in this pilot study that I'm going to show you the results for. The question was whether hearing loss is cross-sectionally associated with brain beta amyloid in this group. And we measured hearing loss with pure tones and word recognition, and the outcome was basically amyloid, which is a hallmark of Alzheimer's. And we can measure how bright it is by this thing called the SUVR, S-U-V-R. Just think brightness. Just think the brightness of the amyloid signal on the PET. Next slide. So we'll whisk through this. There were 98 subjects. Next slide. And so this is the results from pure tones. So the graph on the left shows hearing loss going from 10 to 50 decibels and amyloid on the y-axis. And so what this graph is showing you is that as hearing gets worse, there's more amyloid in the brain. The problem is that age could be confounding this. So we had to do these multivariable regressions. So if you look in the bottom right, this is multivariable. And basically you see that this was significant. So in this analysis, we found a significant relationship between hearing and amyloid plaque, adjusting for confounders. Next slide. And then we did the same thing with word recognition, and we basically found the same thing. Next slide. So in the interest of time, I won't dwell on that too long. But the question is really, because this is kind of like shell shocker, next slide, or am I saying now that hearing loss causes Alzheimer's, because that's a pretty sensational thing to say. And so I went back and I looked in the literature, and the balance of it is that we don't really know yet. So there are some studies showing that hearing loss is related to smaller brain volumes. There's a bunch of those. I think that's definitely true. There's one study showing that hearing loss is related to less tau, which is a dementia marker in the CSF. There are a couple studies showing that that hearing loss is not related to amyloid. So the opposite of what I showed. And so basically, this paper that we put out in Laryngoscope is the first study to show an association between hearing loss and beta amyloid, the hallmark pathology of Alzheimer's, but I don't believe it yet. I don't believe my own paper because it's just surprising. And other studies haven't shown it. Next slide. And I think it really needs to be replicated. So here are the limitations. It was cross-sectional, it was regional. So I think we really need to replicate it, and shows that this pans out over time, and we're going to be doing that. And we need to figure out how the heck hearing loss could cause amyloid to accumulate. Just as an aside, we really have no idea what the heck causes Alzheimer's. We don't have any idea what causes the amyloid plaque. When I was talking to my neurology colleagues, they were super skeptical and said, well, how could hearing loss do this? How could it cause amyloid? And I said, well, how does anything cause amyloid? And they're like, we don't have no idea. And I said, so why are you asking me? No one knows anything. So maybe hearing loss causes amyloid. Do you have a better explanation? Next slide. So we'll quickly go through this. So next slide. Subclinical hearing loss. Everything I've talked about so far studies people who have hearing loss compared to those who don't have hearing loss. But what is hearing loss? If you're studying hearing loss, you should probably figure out what you're studying. So we typically define hearing loss in otolaryngology as a pure tone average more than 25 decibels. That's pretty arbitrary. I know that because twice since I became an attending, I had a cold and felt like I was going deaf. And I had an audiogram, and one side was like 0 dB and the other was like 15 dB, and I felt like I was deaf. Now I know I'm an OCD surgeon, but to me it proved that you could have like a minimal amount of hearing loss and notice it, and it could bother you because I, felt like I couldn't hear anything. It's also a total arbitrary thing because in kids we use 20 dB, so we like literally have a double standard. We say in kids, more than 20, that's a problem, but adults, we don't care about adults as much. They're not as important as kids. So we'll give it more slack. We'll do 25. So we asked the question, do these associations that we found between cognitive impairment and hearing loss, do we already see it in people who have subclinical hearing loss, AKA hearing loss between 1 to 25 dB? Next slide. So to study this, we used this big national study called the Hispanic Community Health Study, which is multi-centered. It took place about a decade ago. People are over 50. The most important thing to remember is in these couple slides I'm going to show you next, everyone had normal hearing. So it's a study of people with normal hearing. Everyone had normal hearing. They don't have, quote, hearing loss. And there were a lot of people, 4,000 or more. Next slide. So what we did is we looked at the association between hearing in red, the pure tone average, and a bunch of cognitive tests in the blue. The gray stuff are cognitive tests. Just trust me when I say these are a bunch of cognitive tests that are used. And then the purple is the analytic method. We use multivariable linear regression to look to see if the red and the blue were associated, adjusting for all the usual suspects at the bottom of the slide. Next slide. We can skip this. I'm just drilling home the point that these were people who had normal hearing. So what we found basically is that among these people who had normal hearing, aka subclinical hearing loss, for every 10 decibel worse the hearing got within the category of normal, we found a significant association with worse cognition on all of these cognitive tests, all 5 of them. So if you're a good critical listener, you may say, well, you found significance, but is it meaningful? Like maybe your IQ dropped 0.01. Who cares about that tiny little drop? Is it a clinically meaningful difference? Next slide. So I'm going to try to show you that I think it was. So here's one of the tests we used. One of these tests was called the digit symbol substitution test. I like this test because it doesn't rely on hearing. It's like a numbers test. And the worst you can get is a 0. The best you can get is an 80. No one ever gets a 0. No one ever gets an 80. Almost everyone falls within the orange, 2 standard deviations. So 95% of people fall within the orange. Next slide. So now let's look at the orange range. So here's the range of where almost everyone scored, from 20, which is the worst, to 46, which is about the best. And the black dot is the mean. And so what we found is that for every 10 decibel worse in hearing, the score in this test went from 33 to 31. So just visually, you can kind of see how much it dinged your test score. The thing is that 10 dB worsening in hearing is not much. That's like a minimal change. So what I did is if you multiply by 2.5, you can take the difference in going from perfect hearing, 0 dB, to 25, which is still normal, but on the borderline of mild. So doing that, like basically going from perfect hearing to still normal hearing, almost mild, we actually found something that looks clinically meaningful. So if you take someone who's perfect hearing compared to someone who still is normal hearing, but not as perfect, it made a dent going from 33 to 29. Next slide. And if you look at all 5 tests, this is the same thing. Visually, to me, it looks like a dent. So I would argue that we found something clinically meaningful. Next slide. So the conclusion here is that worse hearing was associated with lower cognition among these adults who had what I call subclinical hearing loss, basically normal hearing. And the hearing cognition relationship, it may already start when you have minimal levels of hearing loss. And so maybe the definition of hearing loss for adults is not strict enough. That's my belief. Next slide. So this was like the peak of my career. I can retire. I made it to the New York Times. Next slide. Twice. But actually, even more impressive than that, Mike Johns interviewed me for the JAMA Otolaryngology podcast. Definitely clips the New York Times. I made it to do a podcast with a star. Next slide. So just some concluding points. Next slide. So in conclusion, I think we can say now that hearing loss is unquestionably associated with cognitive impairment. There's dozens of studies now showing this, but the causation thing remains in question. So I tell people hearing loss might cause cognitive decline and hearing aids might prevent cognitive decline. It is incredibly hard in medicine to prove causation or prove that something prevents it. You kind of really need a randomized controlled trial. And so that's what this field needs. This is what we need to do. Next slide. And so that's what's actually being done now. So there's a bunch of these. So the biggest one is through Frank Lynn's group at Hopkins. He has a gigantic randomized controlled trial called Achieve, which is like a super R01 that funded by a super R01. It's like the amount of money of like 5 R01s, looking at people who get hearing aids for age-related hearing loss over 3 years, and that should be done in a couple years. Here at Columbia, I'm working with a psychiatrist who, it's actually his study, not mine, but he's interested in hearing aids to prevent depression. So he actually just resubmitted an R01 for that, and I'm involved in. Then the third one is the No-Mem hearing cohort that my Kate Award funds. That's an observational study, but it looks at these neuroimaging measures that could get at mechanisms. And then finally, at the bottom, I spent my winter writing an R01, and so I could tell you in June whether my R01 is funded, in which I proposed another randomized controlled trial to look at hearing aids to treat minimal levels of hearing loss to improve cognition. Next slide. So as a final take-home point, even if you don't care about data, even if you don't care about or believe in randomized controlled trials, you can just intuitively tell that something is wrong today with our current practice. So in kids who have any hearing loss, they always get hearing aids. If you have 26 decibels, audiologists slap a hearing aid on. The kids wear the hearing aid. The parents make them wear a hearing aid. Whereas adults, if they have hearing loss, they rarely wear hearing aids. Why the big disparity? And so I think the answer is ageism, basically. It's a cultural thing. Like, we value hearing in kids because of speech and language development. What we don't value is maintenance of cognitive function in older adults, which I just think is wrong. And I think this should change, but it's not going to change unless we show data that it makes a difference. And so this is what we're all trying to do. On the left is my daughter when she turned 3, and on the right is my grandfather, who probably was a cochlear implant candidate by the time he died. He was pretty hearing impaired. Next slide. And that's it. I'd like to acknowledge all of my colleagues. And then final slide, tell your residents to come to our endoscopic ear surgery course, columbiaendocourse.com, which will be free. Nothing beats free in June on Zoom. Thank you. I will open up for questions. And I finished 2 minutes early.
Wow, fantastic, Justin. That was amazing. First, let me compliment you on the clarity of this presentation. I mean, making epidemiological data accessible to an audience is quite an accomplishment, and you did it very well.
Thank you. Thank you.
And indeed, this was far more intellectually and cognitively stimulating than watching TikTok videos. So there's another kudos to you. And
Yes.
and by the way, before I get any further, good luck on that R01 application. Hopefully, there is some good news around the corner. You know, I was introduced to age-related hearing loss on the model that you alluded to on mice specifically back in 1984. Again, just giving away my age. I was just finishing up undergrad at that time. And at that time, my mentor was Jim Willett. Jim Willett was using a murine model to demonstrate the impact of age-related hearing loss, not just on the cochlea, obviously not the cochlea alone, but take it beyond the cochlea to the central auditory pathway and beyond. And he kept coming up with results that were, to me, astounding, that he was showing not only changes in the tonotopic organization and synaptic profiles throughout the auditory pathway, but in other associated pathways. And he kept getting dismissed, and the complaint at that time was, well, these are mice. Mouse auditory system is one side, human auditory system on another side. And yeah, over time, mice got more and more accepted, mainly because of financial pressures and so forth. But it wasn't really until these epidemiological studies came along that people finally came to accept that, yes, hearing loss is impactful and it does affect the brain. It is not a positive result, a positive impact, and it is quite substantial. And the rationale for why older people need to pay more attention to it was eloquently laid out by you. And you really nicely laid it out that if it was diabetes, you would do something about it. But yet, hearing loss, we are dismissing of it, and it's baffling. And I really want to compliment you on the way that you highlighted its importance and the significance of age-related hearing loss. So I want to open the floor to others to make comments. There are comments in the chat and obviously a lot of compliments. Dr. Cos states that outstanding talk, thanks so much. Dr. Clifford, how much of the age-related hearing loss that you see is associated with noise-induced hearing loss at an earlier age?
Yeah, the answer is we don't know. We don't really know like what age-related hearing loss comes from. Noise at an earlier age is probably contributory, but most of it really is idiopathic. I don't care about what causes age-related hearing loss. That's not my interest. I care about what age-related hearing loss causes. So there are people that spend their whole career studying what causes age-related hearing loss, what does it comprise of, what are the risk factors. That's actually like specifically not my interest. I only care about what things does age-related hearing loss cause, which is like the reverse context. It's probably also genetic. There's been a bunch of studies looking at genetic risk factors for age-related hearing loss. Intuitively, there's probably a big genetic component because it runs in families.
Indeed, that is a very question and a very good question, and it's been debated for a long time. But I think Dr. Golub pointed out that I think it was a study by Dr. Gates that found that up to about 50% of age-related hearing loss is genetic. So clearly there is more than just noise exposure at play. The next comment from Dr. Bangman, I'm a geriatrician, great talk. Main problem is that if my patients can afford hearing aids, not covered by Medicare, they find suboptimal, oops, let me go back up. They find suboptimal hearing correction and don't like to wear them. Any info on improving function of hearing aids to increase compliance?
Right. So among those who can afford hearing aids, they still don't like them. Yeah. That's a harder question. Usually the question I get is like, why are hearing aids so expensive? And then I say, oh, guess what? They're going to be over the counter in a year or two, thanks to Franklin's efforts, because this thing called the Over the Counter Hearing Aid Act. So hearing aids will be available apparently at every drugstore in just a year or two once the FDA actually goes through the regulations. But the question about hearing aids being imperfect, that's a harder thing. I mean, they're definitely not perfect. I think your best bet is to team up with a good audiologist What we really need is a biologic treatment for age-related hearing loss. And those who are in otology may know that there's about a dozen companies and startups really working on this. There's a whole bunch of venture capital funding these companies to try to, have a shot in your ear, basically, that'll treat age-related hearing loss. And my hope is that these drugs in combination with hearing aids will work great. So the drugs will help with the clarity and the hearing aids will work with the volume. But, we don't have that now, and who knows when we'll have it. So I think teaming up with a good audiologist that continues to see the patients and adjust the hearing aids is the best shot.
Yeah, that's a great question. And if I could add a comment there, the patients that tend to complain the most about not getting benefits from the hearing aids are typically, in my experience, those who put off getting hearing aids the longest. And
that's a good point.
Use it or lose it phenomenon applies in this scenario as it does in any other mechanism of disease that involves the nervous system. I tell my patients that once their hearing loss is diagnosed, that is the time to do something about it, not to wait. Of course, it's easier said than done, but because of the financial aspects, and who knows whether those over-the-counter hearing aids will meet their needs or not, but that's a big barrier, and we just have to convince them that it's important enough to invest that money in their future. So great question, thank you, and thanks for your response, Dr. Golub. And Dr. Parham's comments, great talk. Like you, still we see patients or even relatives that don't take their hearing loss seriously. Exactly the point.
My mom doesn't. My mom, like I literally have given this talk, my mom listening. I'm like, so Mom, why don't you get hearing aids? She's like, well, I don't want to. I don't think it matters. I'm like, this is my career.
Well, vanity is another issue. Hearing aids have decreased in size substantially, and they can be hidden as quite well. But still, patients find admitting that they have hearing loss by wearing a hearing aid kind of undermines their status. If that's something that I could openly state. But there is
right.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, finish your comment.
Yeah. No, there is a hand raised by Azim. I want to let him turn on his microphone and ask a question as well.
Yeah, can you both hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yeah, so it was a comment and a question. I guess my comment is that I work full-time at the Albuquerque VA, doing general ENT. And prior to coming here to work, I was kind of under the impression that part of one of the reasons, or the main reason, that people did not want to try hearing aids is the cost issue. But now that I'm at a facility where these hearing aids are actually free, I am actually getting more resistance than I ever thought I would. And I guess, is it too early right now to start saying, there are early indications about cognitive decline? I mean, is it too early to say, scare some people into trying those hearing aids earlier?
Yeah, that's a good question. I just want to make one related comment first. Yeah, everyone says the reason why people don't wear hearing aids is because it's too expensive, but that's definitely not true. It's part of it, but in the UK, hearing aids are free and the wear rates are the same. And like you said, veterans, case in point. So like seatbelts were free when they first came out. They were in the cars already. Did people wear seatbelts? No. When did they start wearing them? When you prove that if you don't wear a seatbelt, you're like 10 times more likely to die in a car accident. So, I mean, that's a scare tactic. So to answer your question, I don't think scare tactics are necessarily the way to go, but I think you can literally say that studies have shown that people who have hearing loss, they tend to get dementia more. We don't know whether hearing loss causes dementia, but it might, and we're doing more studies. And just literally state it like that. Don't say hearing loss causes dementia, just say that it might cause it. I think that's the strength of recommendation you can give today in a nutshell.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Great talk.
Thank you.
Indeed, just mentioning that we'll put it on their radar, and because now it's in popular press, more people are responsive exactly because of that. Early on in my career, when I would see older folks and recommend hearing aids, it really didn't have any impact. But now patients know, or educated patients tend to know about the impact of hearing loss and possible association with cognitive decline. So they tend to be a little more receptive. Just mentioning that and putting on their radar will help. And, you will find that the next time they come to see you, they will be more receptive. Comment from Dr. Johns. Nice job, Justin. I'm impressed and I enjoyed hearing it all synthesized. Talk to you soon, and he will see you at the next meeting.
He's
Fantastic.
excused.
We're right on the money. It's 6:29. And Dr. Golub, any final comments?
No, thank you for being attentive, and I enjoyed my first ASGO meeting since 2006.
It's wonderful. Well, glad to have you back. I know the future is bright with you on board. I want to thank everybody who participated in this meeting, in the audience, and asking questions and interacting with him.